The European transfer window is now closed. So what do the finances and the amounts spent or recouped on player trading tell us about the financial health of the Premier League, the most dominant financial league within Europe? A couple of weeks ago on the channel, we looked at whether the FIFA regulations were driving sales activity, both from a volume and a value perspective. Unfortunately, the audio wasn't fantastic on that video, so we thought we'd revisit the topic now that the transfer window, at least in Europe, has closed. The anomaly to the summer transfer window when it comes to dates is Saudi Arabia. Now, their transfer window doesn't close until the 20th of September, although the Saudi Pro League website states that the 7th of September, which is the day after recording this video in particular, is the deadline for all transfers. So Mo Salah isn't quoted in any of these figures. Please update us in the comments as to how that transaction's gone. For those that don't know, this is Football Finance Professionals, and my name is Neil Wood. My background is a former football finance professional at the highest level of the Premier League, previously the financial controller of City Football Group. So the channel Football Finance Professionals hopes to help you to learn something about finance through the medium of football, given our unique perspective at the highest level of the game. So if that sounds of interest to you at all, why don't you subscribe to the channel? If you like the video, hit like and share it with your friends. We appreciate the support. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. Okay, let's have a look at the summer transfer window with a Premier League lens, looking primarily at finances. In our previous video, which was unfortunately interfered with when it comes to the audio, we were looking at whether the FIFA regulations were driving up both volume and value activity from a Premier League perspective. Now, the data set that we looked at there included all intra-club transfers, and that would therefore include any transfers from the academy into the first team. So slightly skewed from a value perspective, because it wouldn't be expected that any fees would be paid within the club. From a management information perspective, or from a cost centre management point of view, there could be a value transfer, but because it would have been a transfer within the same legal entity, there shouldn't be any value. So what we've done now is we've stripped them out. And what the data now shows us is that there was a lot of volume when it came to the acquisition of players from the Premier League's perspective from their academies. And that fueled a net acquisition point of view in the majority of seasons. Now we strip those out, it looks as though from the 32 Premier League seasons, 31 of them are actually net sales from a volume perspective. But the value is still a similar position to what we saw in the previous video. There is a distinct difference between the amount that's being recouped from player sales on an average basis and even on an aggregate basis in comparison to that's being spent by Premier League clubs on an average and aggregate basis. And we'll get into that in some detail during this video, so stick around if you want to hear the figures. When we look at summer transfer windows alone, so that we can compare the 23 summer transfer window with previous summer transfer windows, the Premier League has spent 24 billion euros across the 32 summer transfer windows that we've seen so far. That's an average of 750 million euros per season, and the figure continues to increase. We saw an aggregate dip in activity both on the sales and the acquisition side throughout the COVID pandemic, but now activity is being fueled again from a number of factors that we'll discuss in this video. Again, looking at this from a summer transfer window, the average back in 1992 was 617,000 euros per transfer. That figure has now increased to 22.3 million per transfer. That's a 3,502% increase. When it comes to the volume of transactions, if we look at the average volume of transactions since the formation of the Premier League, the average volume is 113 purchases and 140 sales per season. And that's with those intra-company transfers stripped out and excluding loans. In the previous summer transfer window in 2022, the average price paid per player was 17.4 million euros. That figure's now increased to in excess of 22 million. And it's a 22% increase year on year. But what's interesting this year is that the sales activity has increased both in aggregate and on average, and higher than you may expect. We've seen a 46% increase in the average sales price amongst Premier League clubs. There's been a lot of activity within the Premier League, but there's obviously been a new entrant to the market. or at least one that's willing to spend. And that's the Saudi Pro League. And that's fueled a huge increase alongside that of Chelsea, who've been trading very much within the Premier League. To take the aggregate figure of player sales from an incoming perspective and the cash that's been committed to in excess of €1 billion in one summer transfer window. That figure is more like €1.5 billion, so way in excess of £1 billion. That compares to just over €880 million in the previous summer transfer window back in 2022. That's an almost 70% increase in the aggregate amount of sales committed from Premier League clubs. A huge step up. 153 players were sold from Premier League clubs, and obviously that figure includes some intra-Premier League trading. That's in the 2023 summer transfer window, and that compares to 132 in the previous year. That's 2022. Now that figure could continue to rise with some windows still being open. The transfer window operates with player registrations being registered within a certain club. Just because the European transfer window is now closed doesn't mean that there won't be any player trading. Those clubs within Europe can still sell to Saudi Arabia, for example, where the transfer window is still open, because all you need to do is register a player in that jurisdiction. So we're in for an interesting couple of days when it comes to Saudi Arabia looking to spend. But what have Saudi Arabia spent when it comes to Premier League clubs so far? And how much has been contributed to that almost €1.5 billion from the Saudi Arabia? Well, actually, Saudi Arabia hasn't contributed as much as Chelsea Football Club. When it comes to sales from a Premier League perspective, those sales that have gone to the Saudi Arabian Pro League total €305 million to date. Now, subject to that figure increasing. Obviously, Mohamed Salah going to Saudi Arabia would increase that figure by roughly 60%. Chelsea's intra-Premier League trading has contributed €419 million to that Premier League figure. So the Chelsea total and the Saudi Arabian total combined is well over €700 million, contributing to that €1.5 billion figure from a sales perspective, which broadly makes up the difference between 1 year and the next. Now, obviously, it's not going to be those two factors alone. What appears to be happening within the Premier League is a lot more intra-Premier League trading than there has been in the past. Manchester City, for example, seem to be more comfortable now trading some of their players to their competitors, with Gabriel Jesus in the past, alongside Zinchenko, going to Arsenal, and now Cole Palmer going to Chelsea. And some players have obviously gone in the other direction, from Chelsea to Man City. And there seems to be a lot more rotation within the bigger clubs in particular, with those fees being driven by those bigger clubs as well. Historically, in the days of Manchester United and Sir Alex Ferguson, it would be quite rare to see players being traded between Premier League competitors, with attractive options for both the player and the selling club coming from overseas. It would pose less threat from a domestic competition perspective, and also the player would get to play in Italy or in Spain, where the football was potentially deemed to be more attractive historically. Now the money is very much within the Premier League, and it looks as though potentially the Premier League clubs are the only ones that could afford to pay the bigger price tags versus those overseas clubs. So what seems to be driving the activity in this transfer window that's just closed, summer 2023? Primarily Chelsea and Saudi Arabia. Chelsea's intra-Premier League acquisitions almost total €250 million. And on the selling side for intra-Premier League sales, that figure comes to €172 million. And that's just what's committed so far. There'll obviously be add-ons to that as well. So going back to the topic of the previous video, it doesn't appear, at least on the surface, that the FIFA regulations are driving activity when it comes to looking at the Premier League, particularly not on the volume side. Although sales have increased when it comes to looking at Premier League clubs alone, it seems to be that a lot of that activity is driven by new owners in Chelsea and new participants in the market, being Saudi Arabia, backed by PIF. But what are your thoughts around Saudi Arabia? Does Saudi Arabia pose a threat to the Premier League or an opportunity? That's something that we're looking to cover in a different video from a different perspective. So leave your thoughts in the comments below. So what we can see from the data is that Premier League clubs appear to be very good in comparison to others at bringing players through their academy and then selling them on. That helps from an FFP perspective because there is no cost of acquisition for that player registration if they've come through the academy, other than any club agent fees. So the percentage of the profit on sale will be higher for academy players versus those that have been acquired, particularly those that have been acquired and then sold with a relatively high net book value. And what we also see since the recovery from COVID is that the net spend per player is continuing to increase. So although the volume of transactions is increasing on the sales side, the net spend, and it is an average net spend per player of approximately 12.5 million euros. This summer transfer window has seen the highest figure per player when it comes to net spend. So is that a sustainable position for the Premier League? And if we look at this from a volume and a value perspective, players coming into the Premier League are increasing in value. They are also increasing when it comes to the sales side, but there is an increasing differential between the two. When it comes to expenditure, that is accelerating far quicker than the increase on the sales side. So there is a gap that will be continually needing to be funded, and that primarily comes from broadcasting income. And if we look back at the data, all the way back to when the broadcasting deal started in 1992, we often see a jump in the average player cost from the acquisitions perspective when we see a new broadcasting deal. For example, in 2001, we see a 43% increase in the average player cost, from 3.2 million euros in the previous summer transfer window to 4.5 million. In 2007, we see a 26% increase when we see a new broadcasting deal come on board at that point. The same happened again, a 21% increase in 2013, and a 30% increase in 2016, for example. So what we're seeing is more and more being spent on an average basis from Premier League clubs, fueled by both player sales and the increase in broadcasting deals primarily. And there will be complementary increases in commercial income, but from a cash perspective, there's likely to be a hole that needs to be filled. Now, transfer fees aren't committed to on a cash basis all up front. They tend to be spread over a number of years, as does the contractual commitment to the player and for that player registration. The two don't always line up. As we've seen with Chelsea, for example, we're talking about 8-year contracts. Most clubs won't accept the payment for a transfer fee to be spread over 8 years, but the player would obviously accept an employment contract for 8 years. But as we're seeing the gap between the expenditure in total and on an average basis increase more than that's incoming from a player trading perspective, there will be a hole that is being generated that needs to be filled and will be being filled by the broadcasting income plus other revenue streams. What's interesting from our perspective is that player trading isn't classed as revenue, primarily because historically it's not being classified as a primary activity. That's a relatively technical issue and something that we're looking to cover in future videos. So if you're interested in the revenue classification of player trading or not as it's presently presented, then leave us a comment below. From our research, it appears that some clubs, particularly the big clubs, are generating more income from player trading than they are from traditional revenue streams, particularly match day, which is becoming more and more insignificant for larger clubs. And the globalisation of football, with broadcasting deals across Europe increasing, particularly those Premier League deals, and with the value of player trading going up exponentially, it does appear that the matchday income is becoming less significant for the bigger clubs, as they eye the fan on the other side of the world and how they can monetize that fan, or particularly look at a player trading strategy that will fuel the financial requirements of the football club. It obviously depends on each club. But that's another topic which is linked obviously to the figures that we're talking about today from a summer transfer window perspective that we think might be quite interesting. And so if you're interested, why not let us know in the comments below. But for now, my name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. If you're interested in further football finance topics, please let us know in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel and why not hit like if you like the video. Thanks for watching.